back, everyone. We've got another great guest for you today. It is Brian Egger. He is the senior gaming analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, one of the most knowledgeable people about the business of sports betting in all of America. And he's going to give us some insight as to where the industry is today, where it's going, and who the likely winners and losers are. There's a lot of companies that are competing in this space, spending a lot of money to grab gamblers and get them onto their sites. And some are going to come out winners and some are going to come out losers. So we're going to talk about all that with Brian Egger. Brian, thanks for coming on the show.
Nice to be here.
So let's start with the size of the sports betting market. I think what most people think of when they think of the gambling market in the US is you've got Las Vegas, you've got the rest of Nevada, you've got New Jersey, you've got all the Indian gaming. Separating it out, I guess, as far as general revenues, all the what we call land-based gaming, all of the casinos and the money that makes from a gaming perspective compared to everything that's going on the internet these days, which is really the new explosion in the US. We didn't have internet gaming 10 years ago, and now we've got it in a ton of states. How would you balance out how much the companies are making on the land-based versus the internet these days?
So if you look at, the commercial land-based casino industry, that's probably $30, $40 billion in revenue if you add up all the states. If you look specifically at online gambling, both sports betting and online casino games, that is roughly a $12.5 billion industry. So not quite as much by revenue, but still a lot of dollars wagered. And if you break that down further, that $12.5 billion is about $7.5 billion from sports betting online and about almost $5.5 billion from online casino games. So you get to kind of $12.5 billion that way. And it's legal in a number of different states, which we can talk about. But obviously, the online portion of gambling is growing quite quickly.
And these are revenues you're talking about, not income, not net income.
That's correct. That's revenue. It's not dollars wagered. It's not the income. It's just basically the revenue generated and retained by online casinos and sports books.
And superficially, you would think that internet gaming is more profitable than land-based, because land-based, you've got all the infrastructure and the guys dealing the cards and the facilities, et cetera, et cetera. Is it more profitable? Is internet gaming more profitable?
So right now, if you look particularly, I'll focus on sports betting for a moment because it's very topical. Right now, if you look at what we call EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, on that basis, the major operators are not yet profitable. They will be likely later this year, for the full year. And the reason not is because it's quite a new industry, because really online sports betting in particular really took off 5 years ago when the Supreme Court basically liberalized some pre-existing restrictions that had previously limited sports betting mostly to Nevada. And since that time, because of a Supreme Court decision, you now have online sports betting in roughly 24 states, right? So it's still a relatively new industry. And as new states emerge, we've had, for example, Massachusetts, online sports betting begins today, right? So it's still a rapidly emerging industry. And as you enter a new state, the startup costs and the costs related to acquiring customers and marketing can be quite high. So to the extent that this is still relatively a nascent industry, it's approaching, and some quarters it reaches, but is not yet on a full year basis at what we call operating profitability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've got kind of a Uber Lyft situation going on, right? Where you've got companies that are willing to lose lots and lots of money to gain market share with the idea that at some point we're going to flip the switch and this thing is going to be uber profitable.
Exactly. So again, in New Jersey, which is really one of the first and the biggest among the biggest sports betting markets, that state has really been operational in the sports betting sense for almost 5 years. And so, that's in a much more profitable state compared to states like Kansas or Ohio or Massachusetts, which are just launching in recent months or launching currently.
Yeah. And what are they learning from New Jersey, since New Jersey is so far ahead of the others? Did it finally turn profitable for these companies in New Jersey?
So it does on a state-by-state basis. You'll see more states reach a level of profitability. and it will take time for others. So you've got a couple of impediments to getting to profitability. One is just the time to scale and build up a customer base. You've got also the upfront costs of acquiring customers and marketing and extending promotions to build a customer following. And then the third can also be, taxes, which vary widely by state. So in New York State, for example, online sports betting revenue is taxed at 51%. Compared to much lower rates in other states. So state level tax rates, startup promotions, customer acquisition spending, all these startup costs and costs of doing business can require a somewhat longer runway in order to attain profitability.
Wow, I had not heard about the 51% in New York. So walk us through that. That's 51% of what?
Of gross gaming revenue. So essentially, that's kind of a top line tax. And the market, New York has emerged very quickly since launching last January, January 2022, as the largest state online sports betting market. But we'll face a challenge to reach that level of profitability, partly because of that high tax rate. So we have different degrees of competition, different degrees of taxes, and different startup and implementation challenges in different states. Still potentially a lot of money wagered. And certainly in terms of the handle or dollars wagered, sports betting online is quite popular. But the path to profitability is really tiered and staggered by state, and it does take some time to reach that level of profitability.
One thing that's kind of interesting is that I've always heard that at the land-based casinos, the brick and mortar, that the sports book isn't really that profitable. It takes up a lot of space. The games take a few hours to play out before the casino wins or loses, and it's almost kind of a loss leader. Is that correct?
So historically, before mobile, that's correct to a degree. If you look at Nevada, which was the longest standing sports betting market before 2018, when everything liberalized, you principally had brick and mortar sports books. And I would agree to the extent that brick and mortar sports books are almost like an ancillary business. They only comprise about 2 to 3% of the total casino's gaming revenue, but they can be important as a traffic driver and bring in customers, particularly during very popular sporting events. So that brick and mortar sports betting business historically resided in Nevada inside a casino, and it's really a comparably small revenue generator and drives traffic to other parts of the casino. That's quite different from mobile, where you look at New Jersey, for example, even though every casino in Atlantic City has a sports book and the major racetracks have sports books, 85% or so of New Jersey's wagering comes from mobile, right? So even though you've got these large brick and mortar sports books, the mobile portion in states where mobile is permitted and not just brick and mortar generates considerably larger amounts of wagering dollars because it's convenient, it's readily available, and quite popular among bettors.
So 85% of sports betting in New Jersey is online.
Essentially online or mobile as compared to the brick and mortar portion. Right. So, yeah.
Yet you have a lot of states, as they consider legalizing sports betting, the big question for a lot of them is, okay, are we going to allow it online, or are we going to allow it only at the brick and mortar locations? But the two things are night and day, right? Like California, for instance. Yeah, California just had two initiatives on the ballot. I'm sure you're very familiar with. One of them would have allowed it solely at the tribal casinos and the racetracks, and the other would have allowed it on the internet. And both of them, kind of ironically, were defeated. But it would have been a huge difference in California as far as state revenue if the one had been approved for internet as opposed to simply the land-based.
Absolutely. You look at other examples like New York State had sports betting at brick and mortar sites at 4 upstate casinos for some time. And then in January 2022, they launched mobile sports betting. Likewise, look at Massachusetts. They kind of had a 2-stage launch of sports betting. The 3 casinos in the states launched on-premises sports books in January, but mobile betting in that state starts today at roughly 10 different mobile websites, including those run by some of the casino affiliated sports books, as well as some others like DraftKings and FanDuel.
Mm-hmm. And how about the same comparison when it comes to online casino gaming? So first of all, let's start with how many states allow you not just to sports bet, but you go online and you can play blackjack, craps, roulette, et cetera?
So that's a really good question. The online casinos, or iCasinos as we call it, really only exists in 7 US states. So it's really not as widely distributed. You've got sports betting and online sports betting in some 24 states, about 24, 25 states, and Washington, D.C., but you've only got online casinos in about 7 states. In states where both exists, online casinos are actually quite popular. And if you look at examples like Michigan, where you've got both, you actually get more revenue coming in there from online casinos than online sports books. However, online casinos are only really operate in 7 states, right? So it's very popular where it exists, but it only operates in 7 states.
So whatever these huge numbers we're hearing about current sports betting online and the potential for it, what we're really talking about is something that could be far greater than that, even if and when states start allowing all the casino games. The big one I missed, I should have said slots, because obviously slots is probably the biggest of those. But we're talking about huge potential dollars if the states start going in that direction.
Yeah, it's definitely I'd say the more untapped part of the market is the iCasino part of the market, where it exists, and it exists alongside sports betting in states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and in Michigan, quite popular, and in some cases generates more revenue than the sports betting piece. But again, we're kind of limited to only 7 states right now, but it's definitely very popular when it does exist.
How would you explain why it is that so many states have approved sports betting first, instead of casino betting?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think not every state has been willing to go the extra distance of allowing such easy access to kind of mobile casino games. Whereas I think sports betting existed via kind of a gray market and illegal venues for a long, long time, but it's only within the last 5 years that it's been legal everywhere. And I think the Supreme Court's decision 5 years ago really kind of opened up the floodgates both to mobile and brick and mortar betting, kind of a widely accepted activity, widely distributed, and rapidly emerged in different states with, I think, a fairly clear-cut sense that you can now do this. It's constitutional, and various states have developed regulatory apparatuses to monitor it. I think iCasino, it's taken a little bit longer, even though in many ways it's kind of a complementary business.
Mm-hmm. It's been really interesting to see how the various interests have lined up, supporting and opposing, and how they tend to flip sides. So, one of them to talk about is, of course, the sports leagues. And that's something that seems to give a cloak of legitimacy and acceptability to the sports betting, because all of the leagues are now on board with it.
Yeah, that's true. Additionally, the Supreme Court case in which the sportsbooks got a right to operate nationally was really the NCAA versus the governor at the time of New Jersey, right? So it was really the leagues opposed to it, but the leagues are now, I think you can say, either involved with a lot of partnerships, not necessarily exclusive partnerships with different sports books, and also where the leagues have really benefited is they have become data providers, in some case, like for the NFL, exclusive data providers to the sports books. So they're quite significant entities involved, sort of as part of this ecosystem, and they do provide a lot of this data, which is so critical to the industry.
Mm-hmm. And then you've got the casinos, which typically were opposing internet gaming. They had a monopoly on it. Why would you want people to be able to stay at home and gamble? I think Sheldon Adelson of Sands was one of the biggest opponents of it. And I don't know if he is he still with us, by the way?
No, Sheldon passed away, and Sands has not. Sands has talked about getting involved in more of an incubator B2B capacity rather than actually operating sports books. But to your point, well taken. But if you think about like the sportsbook industry, you're right, casinos weren't necessarily all on board. But if you think about what dominates the industry today, it's really kind of 2 categories. It's the fantasy sports operators, the legacy DraftKings and FanDuel, which before sports betting was legal, really got their name by operating daily fantasy sports platforms, which translated or evolved very naturally into sports betting. And then the other realm, you've got the casinos, where you've got probably the 2 largest that come to mind are BetMGM, which is a joint venture of MGM Resorts and Team. And then you've got Caesars, which bought William Hill to build out its Penn National or Penn Entertainment certainly involved via its acquisition of Barstool. So you do have now the major casino companies involved, either directly or through joint ventures in having these sports books.
So at the top of the list here, I see of largest, and I don't know if this how accurate this list is, but largest gaming company, publicly traded gaming companies, is Las Vegas Sands. And my sheet here is missing the number, but I thought it was like 50 billion or something. Is that?
Yeah, you're correct. And interestingly, Las Vegas Sands, although it has that name, no longer has brick and mortar casinos in the US because they sold their Las Vegas operations. So right now they're involved from a brick and mortar perspective. They're involved exclusively in Macau and Singapore. And they're very much a contender for a license opportunity in New York State. So they're all likelihood they want to get back into the US market. But yeah, you're right. They've not been involved in online to date. And even their US operations, they are principally right now focused on Asia.
Wow. Well, yeah, they're making so much money in Macau that it's a nice distraction to have. So that's their focus, and that's what makes them by far the largest gaming company in the world.
Absolutely. If you think about this, the size of the company now, this will vary over time based on the stock price. If you measure size by market value or market capitalization, it also varies by gaming revenue because Macau during the downturn, largely due to the pandemic, really lost a significant amount of its gaming revenue. Is now a much smaller market and is sort of gradually climbing its way back, right? So, but still, historically, if you go back to pre-pandemic, Macau is a much larger gaming revenue market than Las Vegas. It's only in recent years that you reach more of a parity because Macau was so hard hit by the dynamics of the pandemic.
Yeah. I got to ask you one Macau question because it's always on my mind, and I feel like I've gotten different answers depending on who I ask. The amount of money being gambled at these Macau casinos just blows away Vegas, right? It's just not even close. The size of their floors are way bigger than Vegas. Vegas has moved well beyond the casino gaming floor and all kinds of other elements of ways to make money and food and beverage and entertainment and so on. And whereas Macau continues to be primarily about gaming, which the gaming companies love that being the primary focus because that, when it's doing well, is the most profitable part of the business. But when I see the numbers coming out of there, they're so incredible that I wonder how much of this is effectively being used by wealthy Chinese to move money out of China, and that Macau is a good way of doing this. I don't want to say launder the money, but as a way of just kind of getting it out of China, as opposed to these are just genuinely people who love gambling.
So you're right about this to the extent that, going back again, maybe more than a year ago, the vast bulk of revenue generated by Macau casinos was from the so-called VIP baccarat business, very high-end wagering, mostly on the game of baccarat, accounting for the preponderance of gaming revenue in Macau. And that really changed where effectively about a year ago, the local authorities essentially put a ban on junket-related credit activity and really shut down a significant part of that so-called VIP baccarat business, placing a greater emphasis on the so-called mass market business. Now, some of that mass market business is still quite high-end, still involves baccarat, but it does involve, as it did before, these large junket operators extending credit and acting as intermediaries. So the game has changed quite a bit because of the shut off of a lot of the junket intermediated business, but it's still potentially a very large business. What's really held Macau back, I think, in the recovery is not only that shutdown of VIP junket credit business, but also the fact that until very recently, there were significant travel restrictions affecting the ability to travel outside of China and have travel going from mainland China and Guangdong province, which is a major feeder market, to Macau. That seems to be loosening up now with restrictions lifting on travel activity. And that lifting of travel restrictions should be a catalyst for growth in the so-called mass market Macau business.
All right, well, let's leave it there. We got to take a break, and then we come back. Let's bring it back to sports betting and talk about this launch in Massachusetts and who's likely to do best there. We got Brian Egger, senior gaming analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Right back.
Higher everyone. I'm Veronica Dudo, and welcome to Buy,
Hold, Sell. If you have the Russians that are going into Ukraine, the Americans and the Germans and everyone else in Europe is going to say, hell no.
If Russia doing things, logically was their MO, I'd agree with you. Yeah, Todd, why don't you get him on a phone call right now? Hello.
Financial News TV, just the way you like it. Fast-paced, unadulterated, in-your-face, rock and roll style. Join us next time on Buy, Hold, Sell Live.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to remember all that. I can't even remember.
Oh, God.
Yeah, well, that doesn't. I want you to, oh, my God. Fast pace, no. Oh, sorry.
Take one.
Fast pace, no holds barred, in your face, rock and roll style.
Woohoo!
Good sign.
Let's kick some
And welcome back, everyone. We are talking to Brian Egger, senior gaming analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, one of the foremost gaming experts in America. And we're just talking about the Sands and how well they're doing in Macau, largest gaming company in the world. You touched on something that I just want to follow up on before I move on, because I wasn't aware of it. So I didn't know that Sands is out of Vegas. So they had the Venetian and the Palazzo. Tell me, when was that sold and who was it sold to?
Sold to Paul about a year, I would say about a year ago. And so that's kind of a major shift for them, but they really have been increasingly focused in terms of their overall business on developing in Asia. They put significant amounts of money to expanding their footprint in Macau, and as well as in Singapore. So that's really where they're focused right now. But they made it quite clear they were interested in the potential, brick and mortar casino opportunity rather in New York. So we'll see if that happens in New York City.
And sorry, so who bought the Venetian?
Apollo.
Oh, okay. Is that their first hotel casino in Vegas?
So it's a major departure for them. Apollo Funds basically bought Venetian. They've been involved in different parts of the gaming sector, but I think for Las Vegas Sands, I think part of the realization was they were generating far more revenue from Macau in any case, and it really was an opportunity maybe to find some other U.S. markets that have, from their perspective, real development opportunities. So I don't think Sands is done with the U.S. They certainly have been quite vocal about their interest in building a sort of land-based casino in New York City. But it is quite a bit of a departure for them. They basically sold the Vegas properties in February of 2022.
Wow. Yeah, those are, I think they were the largest hotels as far as sheer number of rooms, I think, Palazzo and Venetian.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, MGM always had more exposure there because they got 10 hotels, but as actual standalone entities, they're quite large.
yeah. All right. So today just happens to be the launch day for sports betting in Massachusetts. So kind of handicap it for us a little bit based on the current lay of the land. Who will be opening up a website in Massachusetts today, and who's likely to do the best?
So we basically have 6 different sites launching today. Got FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, Wynn, Caesars, and Barstool, which is owned by Penn. There were basically 10 overall authorized. So a few of these will be opening later, either in the next couple of months or sometime next year. So you've got basically 10 authorized mobile sportsbook operators, 6 of which launched today. That itself is kind of surprising because the state really authorized effectively 15 different mobile operators, and a number of those licensed slots either went unclaimed or actually had the few operators, most notably Bet365 and PointsBet, were going to apply for licenses and kind of late in the game decided not to pursue the market, at least for now, which I think is, from their perspective, probably a rational decision. As much as Massachusetts is a promising sports betting market, the industry is quite competitive, and you're entering a state like Massachusetts to be, one of 15 mobile operators alongside the brick and mortar operators in that state. Could be quite daunting in terms of building a base of business in that state. So, these are cases where you've got non-US based operators, Bet365 and PointsBet, that decided to kind of stay on the sidelines for now. And I think you may see more instances like that as the industry matures, although I'm hopeful that customer acquisition and marketing spending will become less intense anyway over time. It's also possible you'll see other states like Massachusetts where some prospective license applicants decide not to make a go of it, at least at this point.
So in most of these markets, on the day of launch, FanDuel and DraftKings already has a built-in advantage because they've already been operating there with fantasy sports and have a ton of built-in players, correct?
I mean, that's correct, despite the fact that they don't have the associated casinos, let's say, that BetMGM has. Ohio is an interesting case in point. Ohio launched sports betting and mobile betting in January. And just for the month of January, which was reported recently, FanDuel and DraftKings together generated 77% of the betting handle. So it's quite obvious those two platforms are really dominant. The largest is FanDuel in most states. And FanDuel and DraftKings tend to be the market share leaders, in large part, yes, because they have that pre-existing association with their daily fantasy sports apps, and they have that kind of customer following. And they've been quite effective in, as sports betting goes from being limited to a number of states to now upwards of 25 states, these companies like DraftKings that have a presence everywhere can also switch to national advertising, which is much more cost effective, for example, than state or local advertising.
Mm-hmm. When we just talk about gross sports betting revenue in the US, FanDuel's number one?
So FanDuel overall would be number one. I'm just looking, it's like FanDuel's market share, as we measured it for the month of December, kind of a year-end point. They were about 40% of the New York market. They were about 30% in Michigan, and between 40 and 50% in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So FanDuel itself is quite strong. DraftKings is usually, a solid second. And, among the others that you would think of as sort of casino affiliated types of sports books, BetMGM and Caesars usually fit in quite prominently. And then you've got other operators that have perhaps smaller shares. That Barstool, because of its historical ties to Massachusetts, may have a chance to build a bit of a bigger share with its launch today in Massachusetts. But it is a market where the big companies tend to be quite dominant.
Does it make any sense for these other companies to start fantasy sports in the states that haven't approved sports betting? I mean, you got some big ones out there. You got Florida, California, and Texas. Once those finally go live, FanDuel and DraftKings are going to have their built-in base where they just flick a switch and now sports betting, whereas everybody else has to kind of start from scratch a little bit, no?
I mean, that's true to a degree. I mean, the fantasy sports legacy business definitely helps. We don't talk about it too much today, but I was at a gaming conference this week where it was pointed out, and it's true that daily fantasy sports still remains quite a significant industry, despite the fact that you now have real money sports betting in so many states. And I looked at, for example, Pennsylvania, which is one of the states that discloses operator specific daily fantasy sports activity, and the fees, game fees collected from entrance fees from Pennsylvania were slightly larger in 2022 than they were in 2019. So even though you've got all this effective, if you could view it as competition from actual real money sports betting, the daily fantasy sports platforms, particularly those run by DraftKings and FanDuel, still have quite a stable business.
And so the total revenue from the fantasy sports sites in Pennsylvania versus full-fledged sports betting, do we know that the difference between those?
Yeah, I don't have that at my fingertips, but it's we tend to get more state-specific data from some states about daily fantasy sports, but I don't have any directly comparable numbers.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, what about FanDuel? Why is FanDuel beating DraftKings?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. They're certainly close, and I can't point to any one specific reason in any state, but certainly from the perspective of marketing, broad distribution, effective customer acquisition, repeat business, Frankly, it's a pretty, you'd be in a very good position to have market shares as large as FanDuel or DraftKings. I think the real challenge will be, aside from some differences in revenue market share where FanDuel is larger, is getting to that level of what we call EBITDA profitability and bringing down customer acquisition costs. Because regardless of the size of market share, what matters to investors going forward, obviously, is the ability of these companies to generate positive operating profit. And I think they're approaching that level. I think all the major operators, meaning DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, Caesars, have that opportunity this year to kind of reach the point of profitability. They're typically most profitable during the fall, third quarter, the fourth quarter rather, because of NFL football related sports betting. But as the business matures, as they bring down customer acquisition costs, as those kind of startup related expenses kind of move behind them, I think the more important thing is investors will start to pay very close attention to how quickly they can turn profitable in these states.
So customer acquisition, as far as I can tell, it seems to be all about put $100 in, we'll match it with $100 of free play, which is effectively like $50 to the host. But is that it? Is that what all of them are doing, or has any of them gotten more creative than that?
I mean, there's different types of kind of customer acquisition efforts, but you're absolutely right. Promotions and kind of the giveaways you're talking about are part of it. Some of the related advertising and marketing has to do with putting forward very popular wagers like same game parlays and bringing those types of betting opportunities to bettors' attention. Traditional media, television advertising, when Caesars effectively relaunched its brand in the fall of 2021, they were definitely very aggressive in terms of bringing their TV commercials on. But I think what is at least initially encouraging about, for example, recent results from DraftKings is, in addition to trying to bring down some of these promotional and customer acquisition costs, they're also finding ways to maintain their player retention. They are, for a variety of reasons, reducing some of their compensation expense and staffing in certain cases, and that obviously can reduce some of the expenses. But through ongoing player retention, more focused and targeted marketing and customer acquisition, in other words, try to be more targeted about it and not having spending money on customers that are likely to become profitable customers. They're approaching a point where they have the potential to be profitable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I know what's happening in a lot of states. My brother in particular is doing it in Arizona, where everybody is signing up for all the different sites to get their free play, their free $100 for all the different sites. And, who they ultimately land with, I don't know. But when you got all the sites offering the free $100 of free play, they're going to all give that out. And then the player is going to play through that, or a lot of them will anyway, and then ultimately decide not to play anymore, or perhaps just pick one of the 10 to play with. That's got to be a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's also a question of not only how much they're spending, but to whom those promotions are targeted, right? So they think the kind of casting a very wide net works to a degree to get a lot of customers. But, I think the sports books are trying to become more sophisticated about finding out who their high worth, high spending bettors are, and to use those kind of, do a lot, I think a lot of the casinos do, which is become more sophisticated about targeting promotions and targeting offers and targeting marketing collateral towards the individuals that are most likely to be repeat higher spending customers.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the experience once you're on the site is going to be really important. I don't know if the sites have distinguished themselves among each other that much. One thing I've been hearing about that I'm curious to get your thoughts about is exchange wagering, which is my understanding, where they're placing one player against the other. You're not betting against the house; they're just matching up two players to bet however they want to bet. Do you see that as something that could become big, and are any of the big companies offering that?
There's definitely, it's a little bit outside the realm of what some of the more established companies are doing. But I think if you want to call it social or peer-based wagering, that's definitely gotten more of the attention of the industry. And so I think you're seeing more examples like this where companies want to either, people want to bet with their friends, or they're sort of not outside the mainstream and sort of betting against the house. There's an interest in maybe betting against the social community. So I think that does have the potential over time to become a more interesting business.
Mhm. Last question. Seems like there are lots of blue skies ahead. As I mentioned, California is got to come online eventually, Texas, Florida. When we look at these stocks and people are looking at possibly trying to get in on this and buy into one of these companies, is all that blue sky pretty much, as far as you can tell, priced in to these stocks? It's pretty much assumed that there's going to be major growth, or if a California came online, that would be seen as something that would move the value of these companies.
Yeah, I won't talk to specific stocks, but I will say that the market overall was sending out a signal, perhaps a year ago, where the relative stock price performance of online gaming companies relative to, let's say, brick and mortar gaming companies or the broad stock market was underperforming. And I think you can certainly associate some of that underperformance to the fact that there was investor concern about the level of marketing spending, about what seemed to be a long path to profitability, and the reaction we were getting from investors broadly, I'm talking about the industry overall, was one of, I think, concern about the level of spending required to basically acquire and retain customers. So I can't speak to the future direction, but I will say that a very important benchmark of success for the public company investor for sports betting companies will be the ability of these companies to build and retain customers without continuing to spend and defer the time at which they can become profitable. I mean, I think the good news is we have begun to see some signs in the most recent company reporting quarter where we seem to be at least seeing a more rational environment in terms of that type of spending. And as sports betting markets mature, one would hope that the level of that kind of customer acquisition spending will be less intense.
Yeah, all you got to do is look across the pond to Europe, that's had it a lot longer than we have, and presumably they've moved past all that, and now they're wildly profitable.
Yeah, I think certainly Europe, UK, those markets are much more established and mature than the US, where really, and particularly in terms of sports betting, we basically had a kind of an impediment to broad-based sports betting up until 2018 and the repeal of the existing apparatus that basically prevented sports betting from existing nationally.
Brian Egger, really appreciate your time. Senior gaming analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Is there a place where people can kind of follow you?
Sure, you can follow me. There are a couple different ways. One is on LinkedIn. Definitely find me there. But also my Twitter handle is Eggernomics, EGGERNOMICS, at Eggernomics.
Awesome. Brian Egger, really appreciate you coming on the show. That was really insightful. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
All right.
I want you to smash that like button.